installment. As always, we are recording this webinar so that you can share it with friends, associates, acquaintances, anyone who you think would be interested in the topic. This evening's topic is, it's so big and so complex that as I was trying to put it together, I realized that it's not a coincidence that it is so big and so complex. Tonight's topic is, what we're going to try to do is get a handle on the United Nations presence and activities in this region of the world, to try to figure out what has become very, very obvious to me, and I hope will be obvious to you by the end of this evening's conversation. I hope that it will be a conversation, because I will try to limit my remarks to leave you people all time to ask questions or comment. I believe that there will be a lot of people participating this evening who know more about this subject than I do. It's not a classic area of my research, but I want to share with you things that we have come across in the course of Regavim's activities. So I'm going to get right down to it, and I'm going to share the screen. And maybe, yes, here we are. So tonight's topic is the UN in the Promised Land. Part of the solution or part of the problem? Here's a spoiler alert for you. The United Nations is not part of the solution. Let's put it that way. And what we're going to see this evening is, starting with the history of how the United Nations was created and how the State of Israel gained its independence and its present standing. When we look at those things a little bit behind the headlines, we might be able to understand how we've arrived at a situation now where the United Nations is actually a belligerent actor in the ongoing conflict in the Middle East. So, without further ado, I hope, here are some of the things that we'd like to look at this evening. I hope that we get to them all. First, a little bit about the history and the background. As I said, how the United Nations came to be, what its mission is, and how all the way from its very inception, there were problems that persist and perhaps have grown even wider and deeper over time. The UN and its relationship with the independent State of Israel, I like to call that Curb Your Enthusiasm, although I've never seen a television show with that name. It certainly is a good description about the United Nations relationship with the State of Israel. We want to look at some of the UN institutions as they relate to the State of Israel, UN operations in this part of the world, and UN operations elsewhere, particularly in the international tribunals. So, the first thing that we need to talk about is the history of where the UN came from. And of course, we have to touch first on the League of Nations, which preceded the United Nations. The League of Nations was formed in the aftermath of World War I, essentially, officially coming into existence through the Treaty of Versailles and the Paris Peace Conference in 1919/1920. The first 26 articles of the Versailles Treaty of June 1919 actually contained the entire covenant of the League of Nations and the mechanism through which the enforcement of those terms would be carried out by the nations of the world. One particular article of that treaty, the Versailles Treaty and the eventual charter of the League of Nations, was Article 22, which established the mandate system. And we will certainly talk about that more. But again, all of this happened really in the aftermath of World War I, where the entire map of the world changed and the nations of the world were hoping to prevent another world war and to create a mechanism through which international conflicts could be resolved without bloodshed. Another spoiler alert, they have not been successful. The League of Nations was not successful, and its successor organization, the United Nations, has not been successful. And here we are. But the question is why? I think there are many, many answers. We're going to look at some that are particularly relevant to our situation here in Israel. So between 1919 and 1943, the mandate system that had been created at the very heart of the League of Nations was the law here in what was at that time mandatory Palestine. But the interesting thing that many people don't know is that the mandates were not actually drawn up by the League of Nations, even though Article 22 of the Charter laid out how those mandates would be administered and what the responsibilities of the mandatory were. The mandates were complaint because the Charter of the League of Nations implied that all of the principal powers, all of the victorious powers after World War I actually agreed to and ratified the mandatory setup and itself. And that was not the case. The United States never did. There were objections which were simply ignored because the League of Nations was built on the principle that the victorious powers all had veto power. All votes had to be unanimous. So France and Britain had their interests. They divided up the territories that were up for grabs, essentially, after World War I between them for their own benefit. Now, here's the interesting thing. Why didn't they simply divide up these territories and annex them, make them colonies, do something else, do something like that? And here's the answer. Follow the money. In the aftermath of World War I, the powers that lost the war, particularly Germany, were being charged by the other nations for reparations, for causing so much destruction. And they had to pay, and they had to pay dearly. So what did the French and British decide between them? We don't want to take these territories and have that reduced from the amount of money that Germany in particular owes us. So we will therefore say, we're not taking these territories. These are not spoils of war. We're not going to colonize them. We're not going to annex them. These are simply mandates that are administered by each of us at the behest of the international community. Therefore, their value will not be reduced from the amount of reparations money that is coming to us. So it was a very, very clever way of essentially having their cake and eating it too, getting control of these very, very important territories, dividing up all these resources that were up for grabs without having to reduce it from the amount of reparations that they were going to get from the vanquished governments. So the United States, of course, objected to all of this, even though President Wilson was one of the main proponents of creating the League of Nations. The United States actually never joined the League of Nations. The American Congress voted against. There was a 2/3 majority was required in order for the United States to accede to the League of Nations, and that was never achieved. So the League of Nations was essentially the European powers and Japan dividing up the world, dividing up the spoils, and the United States had very serious objections both to the content and to the methods and to the objectives of the creation of this mandatory system and of the League of Nations as a whole. another thing that I want to point out is that from the very, very beginning, in all the way back in 1921, which was not so long after the mandatory system was put in place, the British actually substantively violated the terms of their mandate and divided mandatory Palestine, created an autonomous area at the time called Transjordan in April 1921, which was a substantive violation of the powers of the mandatory. They were not allowed to change the borders that had been agreed upon when the mandates were drawn up, but they did. Eventually, this same division led to Jordanian independence, which was officially declared in 1946. And this was explained by the British as the two-state solution, really the first two-state solution for the Jewish-Arab conflict, by creating two states in mandatory Palestine, one Jewish and one Arab. Of course, it did not succeed. And the Arabs, rather than being satisfied with the nearly 80% of the original mandated territory as their independent country, wanted 100%. And so as soon as Israel was created, even before actually, when the United Nations eventually, or the League of Nations, voted on further partition of the remaining 20%, the Arab armies invaded and attacked. We'll get back to that as we move along. But in general, it's important for us to remember that the creation of the League of Nations was essentially a power play by two very, very particular governments, the French and the British, who more or less took over all of the territory of the Ottoman Empire and divided it between them for their own benefit, and having nothing to do with the actual realities on the ground, not cultural realities, not historical realities, not religious realities, no realities of any kind other than their desire to control those territories. And that will have, of course, massive ramifications for the viability of the countries that emerged from that system. But back to the League of Nations. So the League of Nations existed only until 1943. Again, it should have been clear to everyone, and it was clear to everyone, that the outbreak of World War II and all the hostility leading up to it, and the Sino-Japanese War and many, many other global conflicts that simply circumvented this League of Nations, all of these conflicts were proof positive that the concept was a failure. And here's the quote for when it was disbanded in 1953 at the Tehran Conference. The League of Nations has been a disappointing failure. It has been a failure not because the United States did not join it, but because the great powers have been unwilling to apply sanctions except where it suited their individual national interests to do so, and because democracy, on which the original concepts of the League rested for support, has collapsed over half the world. Now, let's think about that for a minute. In 1943, well, even before that, in 1941, at the height of the League of Nations size, at its greatest, it had 58 nations. And compare that with triple the size right now of the number of nations that are members of the United Nations. But at the time, it was clear. And it was clear that it couldn't really work because so many of the countries that were members of this league were not democracies, did not value democracy, and were essentially using this quote unquote democratic international body to further very, very particular national interests. So whenever those interests conflicted with the basic principles of an international peaceful resolution of conflicts, they simply ignored them. And that is exactly what happened. World War II broke out. Essentially, the League of Nations suspended its operations. The Palace of Peace in which it was housed in Geneva was empty for quite some time. And eventually, the League was pronounced dead. It was dissolved. And the United Nations was created in order to take its place. So the United Nations inherited from the very beginning many of the basic structural problems of the League of Nations. As well, it inherited the ambiguity in terms of having a democratic process with non-democratic members. And it also had at its heart the fact that the creation of, in terms of what interests us, the creation of these mandates was extremely problematic and not really accepted by many of the member states. And the resultant states from the mandatory system, many of them were extremely unviable. The Mesopotamian mandate, for example, became Iraq, and the Syrian mandate was actually divided in half between Syria and Lebanon. To this day, Lebanon is not able to stand really independently, and that division that was created was completely irrespective of all of the realities that I mentioned before. And as we know, those of us who are here this evening, as we know, the creation of the State of Israel was, the mandate for Palestine was equally problematic, and the division that was created and the inability of the United Nations to actually make up its mind about the validity of the mandatory system, the validity of the states that resulted from it, and the validity of its own commitments to the Jewish people. So things go from bad to worse, but first we have to give credit where credit is due. The United Nations mission statement includes these 5 very lofty goals: to maintain international peace and security, to protect human rights, to deliver humanitarian aid, to support sustainable development and climate action, and to uphold international law. Now, when you look at those 5 goals, you think, well, that's wonderful. Unfortunately, so much of this is so ambiguous, and some of it is actually non-existent, to the point that it becomes, let's say, modeling clay in the hands of whoever grabs the most of it. So upholding international law becomes really tricky when there really isn't such a thing as international law. There are all sorts of customary behaviors and certain agreements and treaties, but there is not really any such thing as international law. In fact, 100 years ago, the concept, as it was just emerging, was more or less a laughingstock. There was realpolitik, there was national interest, and there was diplomacy. But there wasn't really any such thing as international law. And the question still remains if there is such a thing today. But that's a topic for another day. But these are the 5 main pillars of the United Nations mission. I apologize that I keep making that mistake. So Israel at the United Nations, a full and equal member or not? Israel was admitted to the United Nations as a full member on the 11th of May, 1949. Please note that it was a full year after Israel's declaration of independence, and a full year into the war that nearly eradicated the state of Israel. Israel's application for membership was rejected 3 times before it was finally accepted for various reasons. The United States did not even vote in favor until after Israel was able to hold elections. And during a war, that's kind of complicated, as we know right now. But Israel was not admitted, as every other country was, to its regional group. The Arab countries in this region refused to allow Israel to join in that group. So it's essentially the Asia group. And this has serious ramifications. It's not just like, the kid in class that is being shunned. It's much more serious than that, because if you are not part of a regional group, you are automatically disqualified from holding key committee positions or taking the chairmanship of key committees. You cannot be voted into or have a vote on very, very serious issues, and you cannot lead the conversation. So automatically, Israel, although it is a full and equal member, is less than a full and equal member. And that's where part of the problem begins. The real problem begins actually in earnest in 1974, really 1973, with the Arab oil embargo and the rising power of the Arab countries. Beginning in 1974, Judea and Samaria began to be referred to as occupied Arab territories in UN documents. This was due to the pressure or the desire to curry favor with the people who were holding their hands on the world's energy faucet. But things went again from bad to worse. In 1982, the phrase occupied Palestinian territories became the common usage. That was not something that had existed before. And interestingly, neither phrase, no reference to occupation of any kind was ever used at the United Nations prior to 1967, although the same territories were under military occupation by Jordan and Egypt, respectively, meaning Egypt was the military occupier of the Gaza Strip. Jordan was the military occupier and was internationally condemned as such for being an illegal occupier and eventual annexer of the territories west of the Jordan, Judea and Samaria, which they then renamed the West Bank. But never in any United Nations document were these territories referred to as occupied Arab territories, because it was Arabs who were occupying them, and certainly not occupied Palestinian territories. There was no use of the word Palestinian ever since the mandate ended. There was a mandate for Palestine, and then there was Israel, and there was no awareness or no use of the term Palestinian to refer to the Arab population of the land of Israel. So we got off to, again, I'll just go back. Again, these things are getting off to an extremely problematic start in terms of Israel's admission to the UN, in terms of Israel's status in the UN as a full but not full member, or a full but not equal member. And then the definitely prejudicial use of language referring to territories and redefining them as something other than what they had always been recognized as a means of both appeasing the Arab lobby and throwing Israel under the bus, essentially, for that purpose. Oops, how have we gone? So I think I went too far. Yes. So UN institutions and Israel and what became to be known as the Occupied Palestinian Territories, OPT. There are some very outstanding features about these relationships that we should keep in mind as we go further in. The UN General Assembly does not involve itself in settlement of land disputes anywhere else in the world. And there are land disputes in many other regions of the world at any given time. There always have been, and there continue to be. So we have an ongoing land dispute between Morocco and Spain, Sudan and Egypt, South Sudan, Eritrea and Ethiopia, Pakistan and India, which has been dragging on also for 75 years, even more. Turkey and Cyprus, which many people are aware of. It flares up every now and then, comes out on into the news, but it's a small place. So, and then there's Russia, Ukraine, Crimea, all of these things. The General Assembly does not address land disputes. That is not what the General Assembly is there for. There's only one instance in which it addresses a land dispute and takes a side. And that is, you guessed it, Israel/Palestine. There have never been any General Assembly resolutions that have called for the reform of the Palestinian Authority or for Hamas. both of which are recognized as the ruling powers of territory, and both of which are notoriously corrupt, and that is 100% factual. It's not an opinion. There are corruption indices. There are reports all the time about where the money is leaking off to, and that there is no transparency or accountability. Again, the Palestinian territories, as they are known, or the occupied Palestinian territories, per capita are the largest recipient of international aid in the world. But the outcomes of that aid don't show themselves for the simple reason that there is massive corruption. But still, despite all that, the General Assembly has never issued a resolution calling for reform of any kind, oversight of any kind. There'd be reports now and then, but no resolutions. On the other hand, I think you know how often there are General Assembly resolutions condemning the state of Israel, calling upon or demanding that Israel behave in certain ways, reform certain ways, or obey certain laws, etc., etc. Very, very strange, lopsided relationship there. The General Assembly also did not see fit to even discuss the 610,000 Arab fatalities in the Syrian civil war, which is still not over. The level of violence has certainly been reduced, probably because they killed everybody, but that's a different problem. When the Syrians kill their own people, it's nowhere near as much of an issue for the United Nations as for as is the conflict between Israel and its neighbors, or Israel and the non-Jewish population of the land of Israel. So those are just some things to keep in the back of your mind in terms of the troubled relationship or the extremely selective relationship that the United Nations and its major institutions have with Israel and with this conflict. So now let's look at the people who are in charge here. The United Nations created a very, very specialized, unique system for dealing with or for promoting its agenda in the Middle East and in Israel / the Palestinian occupied Palestinian territories in general. The person you see on your screen here is he's the head honcho. He's the representative, the special representative of the Secretary General of the United Nations to the PLO and to the Palestinian Authority. He represents the Secretary General to the Quartet and is essentially at the top of this pyramid of organizations and programs, all United Nations presence in this region. Next to him, second to him really, is James McGoldrick. McGoldrick was recently appointed. He is the UN Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process, and he is also the Humanitarian Coordinator. Both of these are temporary positions, rotating positions, but he's the guy. Now, the interesting thing is that these two people, these two men, both come from countries that are notoriously, probably at the very, very top of the anti-Israel chorus. Let's put it that way. I would say Ireland is only second to Norway, perhaps, in terms of its anti-Israel agenda and its recognition of the state of Palestine. Very, 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 very top of the list. And these are the two people that the United Nations have put in charge of the entire UN apparatus in Israel and quote unquote Palestine. So these people stand at the top of a pyramid that is unique. And it is called a campaign. The question of Palestine is called a campaign, not by us, but by the United Nations itself. You can go onto their website here and see all the exciting things that are happening in Palestine in terms of UN involvement. And I'm going to tell you just a couple of the highlights this evening, because I want to give you a sense of really how big this thing is. So the Committee on the Exercise of the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinian People was created in 1975, again, in the aftermath of the 1973 oil crisis and the rising power of OPEC and the Arab nations. All of these things began to change in the mid-1970s. Then, in 1977, the United Nations created a whole division for Palestinian rights and began to celebrate the International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian people. That, of course, is predicated on the concept of Palestinian peoplehood, which had only then begun to exist. It was celebrated again on the 29th of November. Anybody who's been in Israel knows every single Israeli city and town has a street called Kaftet b'November. That was the day that the United Nations passed UN Resolution 181, the partition, and essentially paving the way for Israel's independence. And that date will appear and reappear all the time in the United Nations like a hammer to the head. On the 29th of November 2012, the United Nations General Assembly changed Palestine's status from an entity to a non-member state. That has massive ramifications, because even though the state of Palestine does not exist, and the United Nations does not have the authority to create states, certainly not the General Assembly, only the Security Council, and that has to come to a vote, and it never has, because that would be a violation of international law. However, the United Nations General Assembly changed its the status on official status of Palestine from an entity to a non-member state. There are only two non-member states in the United Nations. One of them is Palestine, and the other is the Holy See. Vatican City is also considered a state because it has its own separate apparatus. So it is both a state and a non-state. It's a very strange situation there. However, Palestine, essentially, they created this new category so that they could recognize Palestinian statehood without recognizing Palestinian statehood. So the legality of all of that, if there were such a thing as international law and people actually cared about it, would be a very, very interesting question. But we're not going to go in that direction this evening. Let's look at some more unique things. So as we said here, they changed the status in 2012. And what you see here is the United Nations Human Rights Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. This organization, this arm of the United Nations, operates in many, many countries and territories throughout the world. But what's interesting, what I wanted to show you here, which is why I took this screenshot of this website, is because they began to call it the State of Palestine. By what right and under what law and by what decision have they begun to call the State of Palestine? If you look on all of the websites that I'm about to show you, all sorts of UN websites, you will see that they have a title that says State of Palestine, but here in the text it says Occupied Palestinian Territory, right? So here they don't call it a state, but here they do. Is it a state? Is it not a state? Can you have your cake and eat it too? Yes. This is what my mother would have called dancing at two chasanas, right? You can be a state and not a state, and you can demand your rights as a state, demand your recognition as a state, but not have any of the responsibilities of the state like they're doing here. And we'll look at that further now. I want to show you some of, not all, but some of the arms, actual branches of the United Nations that are part of the UN country team. UNCT is the UN country team in the occupied Palestinian territories. These are 27 different UN organizations that are active on the ground here, have headquarters either here or elsewhere, but are directly involved in the Palestinian issue. So when you have a website that is entitled The Question of Palestine, and all of these organizations are dealing with the question of Palestine, we would expect that there would be some sort of question. But here we have it. Here's the question of Palestine, the United Nations. This is the United Nations in Palestine. And here, this is just a screenshot that I took. I'll show you a closer up, a little bit more clear, I think. This is their upcoming conference. This is happening in the beginning of April. Look at the title, Building Bridges with International Civil Society to Address the Ongoing Nakba. For those of you who don't know what Nakba is an Arabic word which means catastrophe. The Nakba is the creation of the state of Israel. So you tell me, is there a question that the UN is asking? Are they somehow undecided what their stance on Palestine is? If they're calling it the ongoing Nakba, the existence of the state of Israel is the ongoing catastrophe. Now you tell me, is the state of Israel a full and equal member? Do the people of Israel have rights? According to the United Nations, apparently, they do not, because there is not a separate division for the inalienable rights of the Israeli or Jewish people. There is only a separate organization within the United Nations that deals with I've gone the wrong way, that deals with the inalienable rights of the Palestinians. Now let's look a little bit at some of these. We're going to go back. I highlighted a couple of them because I want to have a look at some of these unique or UN branches just to see what it is that we're up against here. Now, many of these operate in lots of different countries around the world and in Palestine. But these, for example, are unique. And let's have a look at a few of them. So one that's been in the news a tremendous amount recently is UNRWA. UNRWA stands for the UN Relief and Works Association. It is unique and dedicated solely to Palestinian refugees. It was created in 1947, and it is essentially our biggest problem. Let's put it like that. So here's the 2022 budget. The direct budget that was given to the UN Palestinian Refugee Association, essentially, was $1.17 billion. And that's a lot of money, but it's not all of the money, because in addition, UNRWA receives funding from additional budgets from within the UN, from the UN's regular budget, where it divides up its bigger budget, which is hundreds of billions, for additional projects, and other UN entities that also pay into UNRWA additional sums. So that's an additional $44.6 million. And we're talking about only in 1 year. And then there were private partnerships. Private partnerships could include things like churches, could include things like governments, could include things like the Rockefeller or the Open Society Foundation or the New Israel Fund, or whoever wants to keep UNRWA actively perpetuating Palestinian refugeeism. So from my calculations, in 2022 alone, the UNRWA budget was $1.77 billion US. That's a lot of money. A lot of money. And what happens with that money? Well, first of all, let's talk about UNRWA. It has an exclusive mandate. Every other refugee population in the world, every other refugee situation in the world, and that includes millions of Syrian refugees and millions of Eritreans and Sudanese and Uyghurs and Crimeans and Belarusians and you name it. Every other refugee population in the world is handled by the UNHCR. Only Palestinian refugees are dealt with by UNRWA, and they are dealt with in a completely different way because only UNRWA has an expanding population of refugees. All of the other refugees in the world, UNHCR's mandate is to find solutions for their citizenship in host countries. Those who are unable to return to their countries, unable or uninterested in returning to their original country, are helped to relocate and to be absorbed and to be given citizenship in a different country. But the UNRWA population, Palestinian refugees, uniquely in the world, are not recognized as citizens of any other country, even if they are. And you have third and fourth generation Palestinian refugees who've never set foot in the Middle East, were born as citizens, children of citizens and grandchildren of citizens in other countries, and are still considered Palestinian refugees. We'll talk about why that is in a moment. So this is the only population of refugees in the world and in world history that never shrinks. It only expands, and it expands exponentially. And you have to ask yourself why that is. We will get to that in a moment. So there's a unique definition of refugee status only for Palestinians that does not apply to refugees from anywhere else in the world. There's also this reverse mandate of repatriation. Even if you have citizenship from another country, you are still considered a refugee if you were a Palestinian refugee, but not anywhere else. And then there's the interesting things that have hit the news recently, which we've known about all along, but now can no longer be ignored by world opinion. The UNRWA shares the exact same agenda with Hamas. That is why Palestinian refugees maintain and inherit refugee status, because UNRWA, like Hamas, intends to use these people as a means of replacing the state of Israel with Palestinian Arabs. And the only way to do that is to maintain their status as refugees and to demand their right of return. So, my grandparents were refugees. They arrived in the United States from Poland. The United States eventually granted them citizenship, and they were no longer refugees. Had the United States decided at a certain point that it didn't like the idea of Poland, that it wanted actually to have Poland look very, very different, it would have held my grandparents without citizenship, kept them in refugee camps, denied them the right to travel, denied them the right to be employed in certain occupations, denied them the right to marry anyone they chose so that they would not be granted citizenship through marriage. And that's exactly what UNRWA does by keeping these Palestinian refugees. And they keep them that way so that eventually they can use them to replace the entire Jewish population or overwhelm the entire Jewish population of the land of Israel and do away with the state of Israel through sheer demographics. If these people were no longer considered refugees because they have citizenship in any other country in the world and no longer have any reason to be considered a refugee, UNRWA would be out of business, Hamas would be out of business, and the possibility of eradicating the state of Israel through the law of return for Arabs would be off the table. So again, the Hamas agenda and the UNRWA agenda are one, and it's not just their agenda. They work together. It has been proven that Hamas employees, thousands of them, are active members of either Hamas or the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. They receive salaries. They're part of the fighting force. They participated in the massacre of October 7th. They held and are continuing to hold hostages. And all of UNRWA aid goes first and foremost to Hamas. So this UN organization is actually a branch of Hamas. We will see some proof of this. Anytime you turn on the television anywhere in the world now, you will see all of the Hamas command centers inside UNRWA facilities, inside schools, inside UNRWA-run daycare centers, hospitals, etc. All of these things are multi-purpose facilities in Gaza. They are ostensibly humanitarian refugee assistance facilities that are actually Hamas command centers with an open pipeline for UN funding. And UNRWA, which is in charge of the entire Palestinian education system, certainly in Gaza and mostly in the rest of the Palestinian Authority-controlled areas, educates for the eradication of the State of Israel, runs training camps and summer camps that teach children to carry out acts of terrorism and murder, and teaches them, indoctrinates them in the philosophy of eradication of the State of Israel and replacement of the State of Israel, all of Israel, not the areas of Judea and Samaria that too many people have tried to convince themselves are the core of the problem, but all of Israel, Yafo, Akko, Lod, Ramla, Haifa, Ra'anana, Kfar Saba, every inch of the State of Israel. UNRWA's education system claims as Palestinian territory that will be liberated through the massacre of every man, woman, and child belonging to the Jewish people. So, since October 7th, we know that 1,468 UNRWA workers who are active members of Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, especially those who are part of the military branches and who have taken part in military maneuvers, actions against the IDF. The State of Israel has presented proof of this, not only to the US government, but to the United Nations and to the world media. We also have proof that UNRWA supplies the premises and the electricity to Hamas, the data centers, the command centers, the headquarters, the tunnels, the holding cells, cages in which Jewish hostages are being held are inside UNRWA facilities. They move them around from place to place in the tunnels that were dug under UNRWA facilities. Their security cameras give them advance warning when so they can move hostages when IDF troops are approaching. And IDF has found inside all these UNRWA facilities not only millions of dollars in cash that are held to help Hamas members escape, but also weapons, missiles, rocket launchers, medications that were supposed to get to Israeli hostages, living quarters for Hamas leaders, pretty much everything. There is no question anymore, which is why nations around the world have begun to either suspend or completely cancel their support for UNRWA. The European Union, our good friends in the European Union, have given a commitment that they will fill in the gap because UNRWA can't be allowed not to have money to continue to supply Hamas. So the EU has already stated that it will increase its donations to UNRWA to make up for the shortfall because civilized, normal countries are beginning to halt their funding for all this madness. So this guy, Elad Shushan, is actually my oldest son's commanding officer, my oldest son is in the 646th Reserve Unit of paratroopers. He just finished 4 months in Gaza yesterday. And in the newspaper, his commanding officer was quoted, there is not a single UNRWA site, a school, a mosque, a kindergarten in which weapons weren't found. Not one single UNRWA site that was found to be clean of weapons. Every single one. So there's no more doubt anymore what UNRWA is. Here's another UN organization that none of you have ever heard of. And this one shocks the pants off me, I have to admit. This is called UN Register of Damage. The UN Register of Damage was created after the United Nations decided that Israel's construction of a security wall to keep terrorists from blowing up Israeli civilians in the centers of cities and on buses and in this massive wave of terrorism, Israel built a security wall to keep terrorists out. And the United Nations decided that that was an infringement of Palestinian rights, and then created this entire branch called UNROD in order to document, to register all of the damage caused to Palestinians by Israel's construction of a security barrier. Let that sink in for a minute. Now, the security barrier was built on Israeli state land. It was built to protect Israeli citizens, and it is completely within Israel's rights to protect its citizens and to build a wall on Israeli state land. But the UN Register of Damage not only was created to document the damage caused to the Palestinians. Of course, there's damage caused to Jewish landowners as well, and Jewish communities that have a wall running through them as well, but nobody cares about that. But the ROD actually seeks out people and undertakes, read the words carefully, it undertakes outreach activities in the occupied Palestinian territories to inform potential claimants of the existence and purpose of UNROD and the procedure for filing a claim for registration of damage, meaning people who had no imagination that they were being harmed by the creation of this wall are now being sought out and informed. And the UNROD goes around and incentivizes people to file damage claims. It also assists them in filing those claims. And by August 31st, 2023, 73,576 claim forms for registration of damage were already filed thanks to this UNROD, a completely unique situation in which UN officers, UN employees encourage or help people to formulate a claim that they did not have before, and an ongoing system to create more and more claims against the state of Israel. What will happen with those claims? That's the next stage. UNESCO. UNESCO is not unique to Israel. UNESCO, its relationship with Israel is quite unique because Israel was actually thrown out of UNESCO for a little while. We were allowed back in, which is wonderful. What you're looking at here at this picture is an aerial view of what was once the capital of the Kingdom of Israel. This is Sebastia, or Shomron. This was the seat of the Israelite monarchy. King Omri essentially built this city. It is an archaeological site bigger and more magnificent than Caesarea, for example, for any of you who have ever been there. There's a theater, there's a hippodrome, there's a castle, there's massive, massive archaeological site. It's being decimated. Under the Oslo Accords, part of the city of Shomron are under Israeli jurisdiction, and other parts are under Palestinian Authority jurisdiction. So What you're seeing here is, I don't know if you can see these pillars. This was on the main road. The castle itself is, of course, up here. This you can see is a Roman era theater, which is actually, it predates the Roman era. This was an amphitheater that was created here. There's magnificent views. You can see all the way to the coast. Very strategic location, which is why it was chosen as the seat of government. And what you're looking at here is a massive project, a Palestinian Authority project that simply mowed over a major part of this. I can't even describe in words. They plowed over a massive part of this archaeological site of World Heritage importance, and they made a parking lot. And over here, they made a football field. Further down, they're pulling up the rest of the pillars from the main road. And all of this paved over massive Palestinian Authority flag here. Here you see on the pillars themselves, this is the symbol of the PFLP, the Marxist militant terrorist group, an internationally sanctioned terrorist group that is helping to control this site along with the Palestinian Authority itself. They have defaced most of the site. There was also a Byzantine era church and shrine to St. John the Baptist here, and it was completely decimated. But what you're seeing here is that all these paving work, all the destruction and all the uprooting of the physical history of the ancient Jewish monarchy here is brought to you by none other than UNESCO, the United Nations Education, Science, and Culture Organization that is entrusted with protecting World Heritage sites. This sign was created in order to launch this fantastic new Palestinian Visitor Center at Shomron. And all the literature that they created for this wonderful site doesn't mention even one time any connection to Jewish history. You can see it's the state of Palestine and the Palestinian Cultural Ministry and the resistance to the wall and settlements and the government of Belgium and all sorts of other things, but UNESCO itself. This is not the only place in which UNESCO is aiding and abetting the erasure of Jewish history in Judea and Samaria. One more organization that I know we're running late on time here, but I want to show you something that Regavim has been involved in. Oh, I didn't mention, we actually went to court, we went to the government, we raised a furor over the decimation of this site. We managed to force the government to enable access to Jewish visitors to the site of Shomron, and we're beginning to see now the Ministry of Heritage that was created as a result begin to take some responsibility for preserving what's left of the site and protecting it from further damage. Regavim was at the forefront of finally forcing the government of Israel to extend the authority of the Israel Antiquities Authority jurisdiction to Judea and Samaria, where it had no jurisdiction before. And we're seeing some serious change on the ground thanks to Regavim's incessant hacking away at the government of Israel. But we still have to battle UNESCO. This organization is called the UNTSO. It is the United Nations Truth Supervision. Right now, what truth are they supervising? They're supervising, since 1947, the ceasefire agreements between Israel, Jordan, Egypt, and Syria. They took this property at Armon HaNetziv, which it's called Armon HaNetziv because it was the palace of the mandatory governor, and the state of Israel allowed the UNTSO, this is in Jerusalem, to stay as a guest at this compound. This is the original plan of the building, the historic site there. So the state of Israel allowed them to stay there and to oversee these truce, the ceasefire agreements that were in place after 1947. I have some news for you if you haven't heard it. There's no more ceasefire agreement between Egypt and Israel or between Jordan and Israel, simply because we now have a full peace treaty. So what is the UNTSO doing in Jerusalem? What are they doing? It's a very good question. I can tell you what they're doing. Sorry. One of the things they're doing, this is just some of the documentation that we brought to court when we sued the United Nations and the government of Israel and the Jerusalem municipality for what's going on at Armon HaNetziv. These are aerial photos showing the development of the site. And this is what they're doing. This is the site, the original site, and this is what they have taken over. They keep expanding their compound, building new structures. They even put in a gas station for their own use without any oversight, without any whatever. Here's a pumping station for their own use. Here are all these new buildings. They also started doing structural changes to the historic building, it's a protected landmark site. This is what the site looks like today. We actually went to court and sued, and it was admitted in court that the UNTSO, actually, no one really wants to know what they're doing here. I know exactly what they're doing here, but that's a conversation for another day. But they are behaving as if it's still the mandatory period, and they are still the mandatory power. They have not recognized Israel's construction and planning law. They have not respected Israel's planning and construction law. They have made changes. They have taken over. They have doubled the size of their compound. They have done things that are illegal and environmentally unsound. And the government of Israel has been afraid to confront them. So we at Regavim forced them to do so by suing both the UN and the Jerusalem municipality and the government of the state of Israel. They reached an understanding. They came to court. They did not want to admit that Israel actually has jurisdiction in Jerusalem. So we forced them to admit that. And we are pursuing this case. And we're going to try, at this point in our history, to get them kicked out altogether. But all over Jerusalem, there are places that look like this. Prime real estate that the United Nations is sitting in as a guest of the state of Israel. They pay no taxes. They answer to no one. They do whatever they please. They work against the interests of the state of Israel. And they are our guests. They are now unwanted guests. And we are working to get them out. So we don't have a lot of time. I've actually run over time. But But back to our original conversation, our original points. The United Nations and Israel have a very troubled relationship. They have a troubled history. They have a troubled relationship at present. And going forward, it's time for the state of Israel to actually push back. Some of the most famous statements made about Israel's relationship with the United Nations were made by David Ben-Gurion a very long time ago, and they are as pertinent today as they were then. To sum it all up, shmum. It doesn't matter what the United Nations says, it matters what Israel does. And we can no longer afford to allow the United Nations to treat the state of Israel as it has treated it. It is time for Israel finally to push back. Luckily, Israel has understood the danger of responding to the United Nations demands, such as in all these international tribunals, the International Court of Justice, all sorts of other trials on to which the United Nations is trying to subject the state of Israel. And Israel very rightly says, A, the United Nations has no jurisdiction to put us on trial, and B, we will do what we have to do. Don't tell us that international law actually exists. We know very, very well what it is that we are doing, and that we are completely within the international customary law. And it is high time for us to stop taking into account the very, very, it's not even ambivalent anymore. It's the hostile attitude of the United Nations to the Jewish Democratic State of Israel. So I hope I've given you a taste of some of the more interesting and unique aspects of the UN's relationship with Israel. There's a lot of food for thought here. It's a massive challenge. It grows every day. Israel has a lot to do, a lot that it can do, and a lot that it can't do in this fight with the United Nations. But the first thing it has to do is stand its ground. So I hope we at Regavim try to supply the government of Israel with ammunition to fight back. Sometimes we have to force the state of Israel to do so, but at this point, I think we have turned a corner, and the state of Israel is not being forced by us as much, but is being supported by us much more, because it has become apparent that the things we've been warning about for years have finally come home to roost in many, many ways. So if you have any questions, I apologize again, I have run over time. But I would be very, very happy to address questions on an individual basis. If you want to read more about Regavim's confrontations with the UN bodies here in Israel or in the international arena, we have quite a lot on our website about the Armon HaNetziv case, about the UNESCO case. Many of these things are still in action, and hopefully will be resolved during the course of the next year as the state of Israel regains its footing after the October 7th attack. Thank you all for joining, and I look forward to your suggestions for future webinars, questions about this or previous webinars, and hope that you will share the link that we send out with people you think would enjoy learning more about any of these subjects. See you next time.